Hey, today we're here in Lickdale, Pennsylvania, formerly known as Union Forge. Founded in 1782. It would have been founded by, I believe, the Grubbs, because they're the ones that put the forge out here. And it eventually got renamed to Lickdale in 1884. Now on the sign here it says for James Lick, but in reality it's probably more so his son John Lick, because he's the one that came in, bought Union Forge, which we'll talk about the different owners, and he actually revitalized the town, because the town was essentially dead at that stage, especially around the Civil War. The Union forges of that style, they were starting to be sort of put out of business by the rolling mills, and they had nothing here anymore pretty much, except what had existed that the Grubbs had put in here. Robert Coleman eventually bought that, along with pretty much most of the other properties here in what would become Lebanon County. And eventually you had like John Weidman. We talked about him a couple times. He was a Revolutionary War hero. He had bought it. Then there were a number of other gentlemen after him that bought it. And by the time it came to the Civil War, just the lack of men to actually operate such a huge operation, because once again, this was a 1,000-acre property. It had blacksmith shops, carpentry shops, a grist mill, all kinds of stuff. And the forge operations, of course, but it was just, you didn't have the men. The demand for what they were doing was going down because it was cheaper. The technology basically had put it out of business. John Lick came in here, bought the Union Forge, revitalized it, updated it to a degree. He put in a brick factory along with other industries, built homes, worked very hard to try to get Lickdale a church. Really was a hero in this area. So we're going to talk more about Lickdale here in Pennsylvania in Union County, Lebanon County, or Union Township, Lebanon County.
So the area that we know today as Lickdale, what was formerly known as Union Forge, is sort of a convergence of the Lebanon Valley. Just starts south of that, in between these Blue Mountain areas and Appalachian Mountains. You have the Monroe Valley, which is sort of northeast, and then strictly north, the Swatara Valley sort of converge right here at Lickdale, or just north of Lickdale, into the Lebanon Valley. Earliest people that came here, settled the area, was about 1683, and at that time it was known as Chester County. Remember, these counties sort of, there weren't that many at the get-go, and then eventually they started switcherooing around, and that's sort of what happened in 1729. This area transferred from Chester County to Lancaster County, then eventually in 1785 to Dauphin County, and it wound up being part of what was called Hanover Township, and eventually became East Hanover Township until they made a request after they became part of the newly formed Lebanon County in 1813, that they requested to have their own township, which eventually became Union Township. So this area is rich in a number of different things, mainly lumber, some really beautiful farmland. Sort of as you come further south, as you go into the Greenpoint area, it's the poorer farmlands, and it's like that's sort of the higher farmlands. And as you come further south, starting into Lickdale, where you start getting into the Lebanon Valley, you do hit some of the richest farmland in that area. So this particular region here in Lickdale really didn't have any kind of settlement. The closest thing to settlement you would have is over where the Bethel Moravian Mission was, which is just east of Lickdale. Even that really wasn't that great of a settlement until Union Forge in 1782. It was 1,000 acres of land that was bought by Curtis Grubb to develop into this forge, using the Swatara, and sort of where what they would call Forge Creek and Swatara Creek would merge. They used that to run the water off to be able to make their runs that they could power these forges. And this would wind up becoming the second forge in Lebanon County, the first being the Hammer Forge, which was much closer to the Grubbs' personal holdings with Cornwall Iron Furnace. We had visited in a previous video for Pennsylvania historic markers for the Hammer Forge Mansion, which still exists. And I guess there's some stuff there that you can see for the dams that were there for the 2 separate forges that were there at Hammer Creek. But you have some stuff that still exists from the Union Forge, but I mean, this was an impressive operation, 1,000 acres, and really brought a community together from all over the area. The only things that may still exist there is I think the one side of the original covered bridge that was built that goes over the Swatara there at Lickdale where the campgrounds are. It would be down, I think, a little further south. I think the western abutment, they say, still exists. Some of the homes that would be built specifically for the forges, there's on the other side of Forge Creek, from where the hotel is today, and it was the Exxon station. I think it's a Subway now, but it was a Joe May station. A few of those houses there are from the original, and there's a few other houses, but a number of the mansions and the really important buildings and the forge itself, that's all pretty much gone. But that's the settlement of this area. So I want to make a couple notes off of this video. You can see the main road that goes up to Inwood. It's that straight area. That actually is basically the pathway of Route 72 today. So if you just go straight down south through there, that's where the road would basically go. I had talked about a couple of those houses that still exist on the lower to southern sections on the left side. Those were some of the row houses, and then some of those houses in the Lickdale village there. Those still do exist, but you can see where the covered bridge went through just a little further north is where the bridge today goes across, and they would have had these water, like these running mill runs that went through, and even had a dam that sort of ran the entire forge operation. Like I said, most of this doesn't exist anymore, like the Weidman Mansion, which is sort of number 2 there, right in the middle. That's gone. That got ripped out. That's where the Subway is today. And on the other side is where the Lick farm would have been, that the Grove family, and I believe it was his cousin that lived there. That barn was ripped down a while back, and they actually used the wood beams, and the original stone for the barn is where the VFW is today along Fisher Avenue. But, you know, most of these, obviously the waterworks are all gone. The rail station's gone. Where the rail lines sort of went through is primarily all gone. But it's really neat to look at these maps and see where everything was located. I remember the second grist mill that John Lick built, because it stood there right on the corner of 72 and Lickdale Road. And eventually they wound out taking it down. It had been, I believe, on the National Registry of Historic Places, but it had just become so dangerous sitting there on the intersection that they had to tear it down. But that was one of the last few remnants of the second coming of sort of Union Forge being reinvigorated when John Lick bought it. But we'll go through the history now of the ownership and just some of the unique things about Union Forge next.
So I want to talk a little bit further about the ownership. The first people that would have bought it, it's sort of, I've seen different things. Like Curtis Grubb, he was the older brother, and he was the one that sort of after the father, the Peter Grubb Sr., passed away, I think it was in the 1750s. He took over his father's operations, and his brother, Peter Grubb Jr., is the one that then went over to the Hammer Forges. Now, they sort of go back and forth between who actually bought it, but it would be more likely that it's Curtis Grubb bought the 1,000 acres, mainly because he liked the location there, what would become Lickdale, the plentiful forest to make charcoal, because a lot of these early forges they were charcoal forges. It just burnt hotter and that type of stuff. And coal at that time was still, until the Union Canal came through, it wasn't as readily available, if you will, because even Cornwall Iron Furnace was a charcoal furnace. And once the Union Canal came through and they were bringing the coal down through, you could sort of upgrade your forges or your furnaces to be able to handle that then instead, because that would burn even hotter and get you more of what you wanted. But they started out as 1782 when they bought that. They built workers' houses. They built carpentry shops, your leather working shops, your blacksmiths. They had a grist mill sort of to feed their workers. Of course, the forges. I think they built 2 forges to begin with, or it might have even been 4 forges, and then they had a couple hammers there. Peter Grubb wound up getting involved with it. I don't know if he was the one that primarily ran it, but then the son of Curtis Grubb, Nathaniel Grubb, wound up taking over the entire operations, and he sort of realized the forge that they originally put in was somewhat antiquated even at that point. So in 1784, he wound up building new forges. I think that might be when they had 4 forges and then 2 hammers, and really was phenomenal ironworks there. Primarily, they made just regular iron, like the iron bars. They also made a different type of iron. I'm trying to think off the top of my head. I have the book here with me. They made another type too. They called bar iron, but it was sort of not quite finished on each end of the bar iron. And that they did really, really well because it was sort of a cheaper and it was a quicker process. And they got all their iron ore and the pig iron, that type of stuff they got from the Cornwall Iron Furnace. So I guess Curtis Grubb, as he was sort of looking through things, I guess he passed around turn of the century, and that was around at the time where his estate, Robert Coleman, came in and bought all that. He bought the Union Forge along with everything else in about 1798. He, though, was looking at it and was like, this just is it, how far it was from all his other works, and already having the hammer forges and some of the other operations, it just didn't make sense to him to continue. He would continue selling his iron ore and pig iron to the Union Forge, but he ultimately wound up selling it to John Weidman in 1802. So he only had it for 4 years. Even the Grubbs only had it for like 16 years. John Weidman, though, he would be an owner. He and his family would own it till I think 1868. Now once again, they upgraded the forges as well. I think they upgraded it to 6 forges and 4 hammers. And in this later part of the village or the video, you will see some of the pictures of the remnants, because there's only one picture that it's hard to see, but it sort of looks like the same thing that you would see at Cornwall Iron Furnace, sort of to set up the furnace. And the forges, those smokestacks, they're smokestacks. They're not the forges themselves. But they ran it till 1868, and I guess over the Civil War, they had a lot of trouble with getting workers because all the guys were off at war. And you would think it would be a better time to be processing iron, but that's sort of where I think they sort of get outdated as well. And other forges and furnaces sort of, if you were at that height of technology at that time, you're the ones that got to work because it was more efficient, you put out more product, and they just couldn't keep up. So I think in 1868, the Weidman family finally gave up, and they gave the rights over to some Miley brothers, and another gentleman. I think his last name was Smith, and they were all from Lebanon. They tried to run it for another couple years and just never found any success. It was just, at that stage, it was done. That's where John Lick comes in to the story. He bought it, I believe it was 1884. He and the Lebanon Trust Bank, and he basically went in, redid everything, and got it going again. Now, I don't think that aspect of the business really lasted that long. Maybe it's about turn of the century. He died in 1891, but he also brought in a number of other industries. So it really was a second revitalization of this community when he came in and bought it and put the money into it. more so because he wanted to help the community, because he was right from that area, more down towards Fredericksburg. But he had family in the area, so he built more housing. He really was a major proponent of trying to bring in a church, and just did a lot of good in the community. And it was never, I don't think it ever became very profitable. But he was also in a position where he could do that, where if he was just breaking even, it was helping the community and sort of bringing it back, and brought it into the 1900s in the next century, and really made that possible. So that's sort of the history of Union Forge, and at that stage it was done and it was officially finished. And you had gone into, now everything was going rolling mills. Bethlehem Steel was really taking over everything at that stage. A major, the Coleman family was, with the Lebanon steel foundries and that type of stuff. It was all going that direction. So these old forges at that stage were just done. And that was where they switched over to the name Lickdale in honor of John Lick.
So here we have John Lick, John Henry Lick. He was the son of James Lick, who actually wound out being jilted by a local mill operator in Fredericksburg, and was told, until you get a mill that's equal of mine, my daughter's not good enough for you. He and his wife, I believe, or the woman that he wanted to be his wife, Sarah, had John, his son, and James was unaware that he had a son for quite a while. And when he came back looking for him, they had been gone for some reason, and therefore he just never met him until much later, when he invited John to come out to San Francisco, California, where the Lick Observatory was a donation of James Lick. He was an incredible man. It really was an incredible man. John Henry Lick was every bit as equal, maybe not necessarily the success you would see as his father had, but he certainly made quite the impact and was every bit as giving as his father. He was born in 1818 and lived till 1891. He came in 1884, bought the Union Forge, which we see here is a picture of it there, sort of like the Cornwall Iron Furnace. Came in, bought it, revitalized it. He actually brought in a lot of other industry. There was a tile works or a brick factory that was brought in. There was a major ice harvesting business in the area, along with a lot of blacksmith shops, stuff that was sort of left over from Union Forge that sort of would eventually go off on its own, if you will. I believe they had a creamery there as well. Now that was brought in by another family, but when he came in, he really encouraged everybody to say, hey, come bring in business. Another thing to note is we see the picture here, that's the Schuylkill Seminary. He and a Lebanon pastor for the Evangelical Association were able to encourage the Schuylkill Seminary to come the whole way to Fredericksburg, Pennsylvania, with the donations of John Lick from Reading. Eventually, they would go back to their original location, which would become Albright College at a later point. But this beautiful college was on the hill there in Fredericksburg and was completely funded by John Lick to bring this college, and cause the reason it was called College Hill. So John Lick really was a phenomenal guy. You can visit his mausoleum in the Cedar Hill Cemetery in Fredericksburg, Pennsylvania, but they do have on the current Lickdale sign, town sign, it says, in honor of James Lick, but really at the end of the day, the person that had more to do with Lickdale being what it had become at that time was John Lick. Like with any small town at this time period, especially with Lickdale, like Lickdale is quite small today. This was a much larger area with the Union Forge, with the other businesses. It was an extraordinary community. You know, you had your schools in the area. You had even a local baseball team like you see here. Really around the turn of the century, late 1800s into the early 1900s, it was quite a happening place. They even had the rail station that would have followed, where the Lebanon to Tremont. that would wind up having a line going off of it for what would become, in the 1930s, Fort Indiantown Gap, which brought a lot of rail traffic, especially during World War II. But extraordinary families that were in this area, like the blacksmith family that you see there, firefighters, which you see there, a lot of really cool, unique community buildings and businesses that were in the area. Think about Woods Creek, which was just to the north on Route 72, was quite the place. There's another place called Boone's Picnic Area or something like that, where it was another, I'm not really sure where that was. You had the village of Onset, where they had their own band that you see here. Really, it's pretty neat, like the history, like all the different stuff that they had, the community features. It really is. I would have loved to seen this town in its heyday, simply to have experienced what this was like. And this is actually the Yost grist mill that was on that corner of Lickdale Road and 72. When it stopped being a grist mill, it actually got turned into a garage and like gas station. I sort of thought at first this might have been where the Hess is, well, I think it's a Speedway, but it was a Hess. But the old store there, that was the old gas station, that was actually, I think, the stored building from the very end of the Union Forge period, which would probably have been built by John Lick. I think it was called the Stein Store. And this is, here you see the barn that used to be where Wendy's is and the hotel. That was the Weidman, or the Lickdale barn, that John Lick bought or built, and that's the one that they made into the VFW post now, like the wood beams and that type of stuff. But it's nonetheless, it's just, you see such a vibrant community that existed at one point here in this town of Lickdale. So talking about the days of the past, this is the Weidman Mansion. This was actually considered a place of refuge. We talk about these different forts. You had the Fort Swatara during French and Indian War, but this was another one of them. And there was one more north. I think it was the Groh, Groh, place of refuge as well. But they had these all over the place. But it's such a unique, and that's actually, I think, the Groh farm there. So that farmhouse would have originally been one of those, maybe not the original, but where the original, another one of these places of refuge. And that was Lickdale, because of it being right there at the merging of these different valleys, and obviously the Swatara Gap became a really, really hard area to live. They actually had over at the Bethel Moravian Cemetery, there's 4 guys that were all killed in one raid that are buried there, and we have to visit that at some point. But this is the old Lickdale covered bridge that went over the Swatara, long since been replaced. And then we see the rail station. It was just a smaller, but it was a pretty significant station, especially during World War II. It became more known as the Fort Indiantown Gap Station, because of this is where the troops would go out, get on the trains, and be taken out to the East Coast to go over to fight in World War II. Village of Lickdale, it really was such a vibrant community. And you think about it, I say earlier in the video that it would have been so cool to see this in its heyday, because it's hard to imagine the small town that it is now, because it slowly dwindled and dwindled as buildings have been taken down, and you just wonder, what was it really like? I remember this old blacksmith shop that's where I'm trying to think of the name of the trucking company that's there, Swift. That was on that side of the road. There was 4 or 5 homes on that side, including the old blacksmith shop. There was a larger one that operated in several different other fashions. It was stone that was part of the original complex at Union Forge. And this is the grist mill. It's actually a grisly story about that. Is a C.W. Yost who ran this grist mill. He actually was killed. I guess in winter his jacket caught in the wheel, and it sort of ripped them apart, and it was a tale there. And I think this is cool here. I'll say it's all right bread, like the different local products that they had. Try it, it's all right bread. It's pretty cool labeling there. But it was a sad story about the man, and how they found him later. One of the other businesses that we talked about was the ice harvesting. They still had that dam there, and I guess it was right just north of the dam on the Swatara Creek. They had a dam, a second dam, and the water built up there. They would go in, they'd cut the ice, and then they would take it to this extraordinarily large warehouse, which I really don't, I would assume that's probably somewhere on the complex of the Union Forge. They just sort of utilized, because all the trees had been cut down, and utilized that to have these ice warehouses that would basically service the entire Lebanon County area. The other unique mill works they had were, it was a tile works, and there was this building here. Like, how large exactly it was, I really can't find, but it was a pretty substantial business, and I think John Lick had a lot to do with bringing that in, trying to bring in these different unique businesses, and brick making was a big business. And this is, I think this house still stands today, is one of the last places that was built with the Lickdale bricks. I think it's on the western side of Route 72, right there in the village proper that still exists. But yeah, it was a village that had a lot of industry, a lot of cool past, a lot of really cool memories for people, and sadly most of those people are now gone that would remember this as it was. So in closing, I just want to say, first off, thanks to Francis Ditzler. This is the book where I got my information. It's a lot of these towns sometimes, you don't always have such easy access to information. And Francis Ditzler, he's since passed. My dad knew him pretty well. They worked together with Armour Bordner to try to preserve that Swatara Gap area where Greenpoint and all those villages were when the dam project was being proposed, and taking people's property with eminent domain. So he grew up in Greenpoint, lived in Lickdale. He actually lived, I think, right down from where Woods Creek was. I believe that's the home that he had there with his wife. But this book was extraordinary, not only for the pictures, but for all the information. I've actually done a couple of different videos with the silver and gold videos, Swatara Gap stuff, and it really pretty cool guy. I wish I could talk to him today about everything, but he was a major student of history. He's responsible for the Sadison's Lutheran Church historic marker, Pennsylvania historic marker. He's also responsible, I think, for the Swatara Gap one, and I believe as well the Joseph Johns Memorial that's there at Camp Bayshore. But this was a really fun video to do. I really enjoy doing these videos, especially on my local hometown area, which Lickdale was a major part of that. I remember all the old buildings that aren't there anymore, and just the little shops and stores, and great memories of riding bike down through there with my friend Nate. We used to get cheeseburgers and slush puppies and soda and French fries at Woods Creek, which I think were still the best burgers ever, and then ride down to his grandfather's house on Fisher Avenue, and we'd go fishing and hunting and that type of stuff. But really, Lickdale has an extraordinary history, and it's so many of these small towns you see today where they're very, very tiny communities and just not the vibrant centers of commerce and village life in general. You talk about in the one section about just everything that was right there in that community, and made possible by the Grubbs, by the people that lived there, of course, and worked there. Made possible as well by John Lick sort of bringing it back to life for probably a period of 50, 60 years, and therefore named in his honor, and most likely in his father's to a degree as well. But it's a lot of fun doing this, so I wanted to give a tribute, the credits there. The credit will also be in the end credits as well, to have the citations and do that correctly. But as always, I want to thank you guys for coming along on another video here, Hometown Foundations, and as always, we will see you all about town. Hey, I just want to say thank you for watching the video. If you could please like and subscribe if you haven't already done so, that would be great. And we also have a Facebook page, we have an Instagram page. If you'd like to support the channel, there is a Patreon.
There are ways of contacting us at thehometownhistorian@gmail.com, and also via mail at P.O. Box 143, Annville, Pennsylvania 17003. All that information is on the descriptions of each video and also in the about for the channel. So thank you once again, and we'll see you all about town.